Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the next lesson of my Learning Japanese installment series. Now today it's gonna be more grammar, joy. I mean, this wasn't really that difficult, thank you for not forgetting about me and my existence in my long absence, but now let's get right to it. This is gonna be a lot of stuff, so it's gonna be a very cramped video. Hopefully I will not overwhelm you, but I just want you to know that once you know this, Japanese gets pretty easy after this, so just bear with it, go with the flow, and perhaps rewatch this video a couple of times if it's not clear. You can always ask questions in the comment section down below, and for the rest, I guess just lay back and enjoy. I'll actually not be going by the conventional approach, like the way most most English textbooks would teach you Japanese. That's too limited in my opinion. I want you to really understand the verbs and be able to freely conjugate verbs and not just follow some vocabulary lists and be restrained to the list of verbs that you know. So that's why this video is going to be a little complicated at times, but it's going to get clearer near the end. I can promise you that. So now I'll get started. In the Japanese language, all verbs are divided into one of three groups. You have the U-verbs, you have the RU-verbs, and then you have a couple of odd ones or exceptions. I think there are only like 2 or 3 verbs that you can really call exceptions. Now how do you tell the difference between U-verbs and RU-verbs? Only the verbs that end with eru or iru, they are all RU-verbs. Well, not all of them, there are like 5 exceptions, but I'll talk about that in a second. But most of them, like 99% of the verbs, they are RU-verbs. All the rest are U-verbs. Unfortunately, every language comes with exceptions, so does this language. There are a couple of verbs that end with eru or iru, and they are U-verbs instead of RU-verbs. So some of the most famous ones would be kaeru, which means to go home, that's an U-verb. Another one would be hairu, which means to enter, that's also an U-verb. Kiru, which means to cut, that's also an U-verb, and shaberu, which means to speak or to chat, that's also an U-verb, you guessed it. There are a couple more, but if I ever come across them, then I'll tell you. I mean, I don't want to, like, shove everything in your face all at once. We'll see everything gradually. I mean, this is all a lot of information to process. Now let's go onwards. That's basically it in terms of dividing them, in terms of putting them in the right category. If it doesn't end with ru, then it's definitely not a ru verb, and if it ends with ru, then it has to end with eru or iru. A nice example of this would be miru, which means to see, or taberu, which means to eat. Hopefully that's clear. And then in the odd ones or exceptions, you have the verb to do and the verb to come. So they're very, very common, I guess, in the Japanese language. So they won't really be like a big obstacle, because you'll get used to them and you won't really have any problems with them. I promise you that. So what is the first thing you have to do if you want to conjugate verbs now? It's actually not really that difficult, but it may seem complicated at first. So, as you may have noticed, I've already introduced a couple of verbs in some previous videos, and these verbs always ended with the u sound. So it was like nomu, hanasu, kau, taberu, so it always ends with u at the end. So what do you need to do? You need to take this word, and then you inflect the last syllable into the 5 vowels that there are. You will be making 5 stems with these things. Now, stems may sound like Latin, but it's really not too difficult. So for nomu, that's an U verb, that would become noma, nomi, nomu, nome, nomo. So you'll just be following the chart a, I, U, e, o. You can do this with a lot of verbs in the U verb group. So you have hanasu would turn into hanasa, hanashi, hanasu, hanase, hanaso. Kaku, to write, would be kaka, kaki, kaku, kake, kako. To buy, that's a little special, I guess, because to buy in the a stem, kau, in the a stem that would turn not into ka, because that's impossible to pronounce. Instead, they turn it into kawa. So you would have kawa, kai, kau, kae, kao. A second and a last kind of exception or thing to point out is that the o stem is not a short o, but it's a long o. So it's kako, nomo, hanaso, kao. That's how to pronounce it, so it's not kako, nomo, or something like that. Furthermore, besides these 5 vowel stems, so I'll call them a, I, U, e, and o stem, so the a stem, the I stem, the U stem, the e stem, and the o stem. Besides these stems, you have the ta and the te form of a verb. They're not really stems, but they're very important to be able to make. In kaku's case, that would be kaita, kaite. Nomu would become nonda, nonde. To speak would become hanashita, hanashite. To buy would become katta, katte. How do you make these te forms? That's kind of, you kind of have to study this by heart. So basically, all U verbs that end with ru, with tsu, or with u, they all become te with a double T, or ta with a double T. An example would be to buy. kau becomes katta or katte. The second group would be verbs that end with mu, nu, or bu. These become nde or nda. A good example would be nomu, which means to drink. That would be nonda or nonde. The next group would be the verbs ending with su. These become shite or shita. Hanasu, hanashite, hanashita. I had some trouble pronouncing it myself. The next group would be all the verbs ending with ku, like kaku. This would become ite or ita. So kaku becomes kaita, kaite. And then you have verbs ending with gu. I don't think I have yet introduced any verbs that end with gu, but a good example would be to swim, oyogu. The gu turns into ide or ida. So it's like a soft version of kaku, which becomes ita or ite. So to take a look at oyogu, you would have oyoide or oyoida. Because these are stems, they don't carry meaning on their own just yet. Obviously, you have to add something to the stem for it to have meaning. Now, I'll talk about that later, but first let's take a look at the second big group of verbs. You have the RU-verbs. Now, the RU-verbs are very similar to U-verbs. They are also a very big group. Now, first I'd like to point out that not all verbs ending with ru are actually RU-verbs. No, verbs that end with eru or iru are just RU-verbs. The other verbs that end with ru, so like, I don't know, okuru, which means to send, so all verbs ending with uru, aru, or oru, so that's not eru or iru, they are all U-verbs and conjugated as U-verbs instead. Now, what's the difference, or the big difference between RU-verbs and U-verbs? You have the a and the e stem, that's different. Instead of inflecting the RU-verbs to the a and the e sound, you just drop the last sound. And it's a very short stem then, so it doesn't really, so they look identical actually. Then the u stem is just the dictionary form, so it ends with eru, so you have like taberu, neru, iru. The e stem is very logical, it's just inflected to the e sound, so you have taberu would be tabere, neru would be nere, miru would be mire. And the o stem is also a little different. Instead of saying miro, you say miyo, so it has a yo at the end. Same goes for taberu, that would become tabeyo. The ta and the te form, on the other hand, are very easy to make in the te form and the ru group. So you would just have to drop the final ru and then add a te instead. So taberu would become tabete, miru would become mite, neru would become nete or neta, tabeta, mita. That's the ta form, obviously. Now, these are the two major groups, so you just have to kind of learn the rules by heart. So the rules being that all verbs are U-verbs except the ones that end with eru and iru. These belong to the ru group. And now to move on to the third group, you have the exceptions. So the exceptions, there are only two verbs, to do and to come. They're very common, so you'll get used to them very easily. Now, I'll just go over their inflection because there isn't really a rule to learn here. You just have to learn it by heart. The a stem is just shi. So you have shi, suru, sure, shio, shita, shite. Now this is the verb to do. Then you have the verb to come, which would be ko, ki, kuru, kure, koyo, kita, kite. And that's it. Now I will teach you what to do with these stems, because obviously you can't really do too much with it just yet. Now, I may or may not have already said that in Japanese, you can actually speak informally and formally. This means that every verb can be conjugated in two ways. So yeah, you have an informal, or a kind of like short form of the verb, and then you have a long form of the verb, which is more commonly known as the must form of the verb. Now, because it's the easiest to just start with the must form, I'll start with the must form. The next lesson I will handle the short form and how to form that. Now, what do you need to do in order to create the must form? You have to take the second stem, so the e stem, and then add must to it. So that's really easy. I'll give you a couple of examples. Kaku, that would be kaki plus mas, kakimasu. Taberu would become tabe plus mas, tabemasu. Suru would become shi plus mas, so that would be shimasu. Now you can try practicing this on your own. You can take a look at some other verbs and perhaps make their own inflection column and then start studying on your own. This is really easy stuff. So that's how to make the must form. Now this just means I eat, I do, I sleep. If you want to conjugate this, then it becomes the following. If you want to say the past positive, so I slept, I ate, I did, then you would turn mas into mashita. So kaku would be, or kakimasu would become kakimashita. I wrote. The next one, that would be present negative, I don't write, that would become masen, so kakimasen. And then the past negative would become kakimasen deshita. Kakimasen deshita. Now you may notice that this actually sounds very similar to the way des is conjugated. So you have des, deshita, dewa arimasen, dewa arimasen deshita. It's very similar. Now it's just mas, masen, mashita, and masen deshita. It's still quite logical, very easy to get used to. The short form is a little more complicated, but I won't really touch it just yet. So yeah, that's pretty much it for the verbs. Hopefully this is not too complicated just yet. So what have I taught you so far? I have now taught you the existence of the three big groups of verbs, and I've also taught you how to put a verb that you encounter in the right group, and I've also taught you how to inflect it, depending on which group it is a part of. And I've also already taught you that one of the stems can be turned into the Masu form, which is the regular, just normal, formal way of speaking. That's pretty much it. So now you can already do a lot. I'll also actually include a practice sheet in which you can practice the verbs which you've already learned in many different ways. So I'll give you some exercises on making the stems, I'll give you some exercises on turning it into the must form, etc, etc. So you will have plenty of exercise. Now thank you for watching. I will now go onwards to the next part of the video, which is the vocabulary segment. And guess what? It will include verbs. So let's start with the verbs. I'm gonna put the U and the RU-verbs apart a little bit, so let's go first with the U-verbs. You have to meet, which would be au, au. You have to walk, which would be aruku, aruku. To swim, that's oyogu, oyogu. To sing, that would be utau, utau, utau. To play, that would become asobu, asobu, asobu. To drive, usually drive a car or a vehicle at least, that would become unten suru, unten suru. To clean, that would be soji suru. Now try to lengthen the so sound, so it's soji suru. To enter, that would become haeru, hairu, hairu. And then you have to go home, that would be kaeru, kaeru. Now try not to say kairu, it's kaeru, so it's an e sound in the middle, it's not an i sound. Then you have to cut, that would be kiru, kiru. To wait, that would be matsu, matsu. To take, from taking a picture, that would be toru, toru. To understand, that's wakaru, wakaru. To die, that's shinu, shinu. To stand, that's tatsu, tatsu. Now let's go onwards to the root verbs. Yeah, it's a very long list, but I really want to include a lot of verbs for you to be able to practice with. So in the root verb columns, let's start out with to wear clothing. This is the verb kiru. Now try to not mix this up with the verb to cut, which is also kiru, but one is a root verb, the other one is an U-verb, so that means that the conjugation also looks different. It's kimas for to wear, and it's kirimas for when you want to talk about when you're cutting something. Now that's just besides the point. Let's go on to the next verb. You have to leave, like leaving a building or something. That's deru, deru. Then to go out, like as in going out to party or something like that, then that's usually said as dekakeru, dekakeru. You have to open, akeru, akeru. To borrow from someone, that's kariru, kariru. To forget, that's wasureru, wasureru. And to close, that's shimeru, shimeru. Now I want to quickly add with akeru to open and shimeru to close that these verbs are transitive. That means that they need an object. So you open something. It's not something that opens on its own. If you want to say that, then it's a different verb. And for your information, that would be aku instead of akeru. I'm going to make an entire lesson about that in the future, but for now, it's just a transitive verb, which means that it needs a direct object. You open or you close something. Now this is still not the end when it comes to vocabulary. I also have a couple of nouns for you because, to be honest, my noun list is still quite limited so far, so I put a couple of them in there. You have betto. Betto. Don't mind the sound, please. Betto. That's a bed. Shashin. Shashin. That's a picture, like to take a picture. Uta. That's a song. Radio. That's a radio, obviously. Terebi. That's a television. Tabemono. That's food, like things you eat. Nomimono. That's things you drink, so it's drinks in general, beverages. Ryoko. That's a trip. Computer. That's a computer, obviously. These are all katakana words, so computer, television, radio, bed. These are all katakana words because they're taken from the English language usually. The next word is senko. Senko. That's your major. If you're studying something at university, then your major subject, that would be your senko. It's a lengthened o sound at the end as well. Then the times of the day. Morning, that would be asa. Asa. Midday, that would be hiru. Hiru. And night, it can be both like actually in the middle of the night, or it can also be like as the sun is going down, that kind of night. That would become yoru. Yoru. Wow, that was a very long vocabulary part. I'm sorry for that, but hey, I just want to give it to you guys. If you want to study it, you can study it. You can find a link to all the documents in the description below. So the document list includes, of course, the vocabulary list, some extra exercises to practice the stem forming and stuff and the conjugating, which I've shown you so far. And it also contains the theory sheet of the lesson which I gave you today. Now thank you for watching. Now let's go onwards to the last segment of the video, which is the segment in which I show you how to write the next 10 hiragana symbols. Enjoy! If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like, comment and subscribe if you want to show some support.